Welcome to Ideas at Ford. I'm Darren Walker, a brown-skinned African-American man with a bald head, lucite framed glasses, a blue blazer, and a blue and white striped shirt. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm delighted to welcome Eric Foner, the Pulitzer Prize winning author, noted historian, to talk about a body of work, not just his most recent book, The Second Founding, but a lifetime, a career committed to one era. And through this period of American history, the Civil War, after the Civil War, he has illuminated America's inner soul, its spirit, through history. So welcome, Eric Foner. I hope you will now join me and go off of mute and put your video away.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Darren. It's great to see you.
I am really, really happy you are here, Eric, and delighted to have a chance to hear from you directly about this book and about, as I say, that has been made notoriety and celebrated for how you have brought forth this period of history. So in this book, we're talking about a series of amendments and a period of time called Reconstruction. Why do we need to understand Reconstruction in the 21st century?
Well, Reconstruction, as you know, took place about a century and a half ago, so it's a totally reasonable question. But the fact is that so many of the issues that are roiling and confronting our society today are Reconstruction issues. Who should be a citizen of the United States? That's being fought out on our border with every day, it seems. And that's a Reconstruction question. The definition was redefined in Reconstruction. Who should have the right to vote? Fought out bitterly, violently in Reconstruction, still being contested in many state legislatures today. What about domestic terrorism? We've seen evidences of that earlier this year, as you all know, but the Ku Klux Klan, violent domestic terrorism, uprisings to overturn democratically elected governments, that took place in Reconstruction also. So one could go on, but I think the point is that Reconstruction issues are on the front page, so to speak, of our newspapers every day. And therefore it is essential, I think, to be a kind of informed citizen, to know where all this came from, particularly in the aftermath of Civil War and slavery.
We'll talk about the three amendments that are foundational to this idea of the second founding. I mean, the second founding, I don't think anyone has framed this period of time and this series of amendments. I mean, there's one founding in this country. It was a series of amendments, a constitution, a period of time in the 18th century, and we were founded. And now you're talking about a second founding.
Well, I chose that term in order to drive home the point that, yes, three amendments were added to the Constitution in Reconstruction, but they weren't just kind of minor alterations of a existing structure. They fundamentally changed it. They were what one Republican Party leader at the time called a constitutional revolution. And I want to encourage people to think of those who rewrote the Constitution in Reconstruction on the same level as the Madisons and the Hamiltons and the George Washingtons.
But we don't even know who these people are.
Right. James Ashley,
these people.
John Bingham, James Ashley, Henry Wilson. These are not household names. Charles Sumner, maybe a little bit better known. Thaddeus Stevens. You could run down the list, but these are founders of the world we live in today. We're no longer living with the Constitution that the founders of 1787 created. We're living for the first time with a constitution that irrevocably abolished slavery in this country. The original Constitution protected slavery, as you well know. We're living with a constitution that for the first time put the idea of equality among all Americans, regardless of race, into the Constitution.
I mean, that's not, when people in America, Eric, talk about equality, they talk about the founding documents that made it possible for us to think about a new society, a new democracy where equality for all and justice for all were these ideas that were adjudicated in the 1780s. And you're now saying something very different.
Yeah, I am. And yes, the idea, the Declaration of Independence, of course, begins with those immortal words, all men are created equal.
Right.
A radical idea in the late 18th century, certainly. But it was not implemented at all. Obviously, this was a country where 20% of the population were African-American slaves when the Constitution was written. Slavery expanded rapidly throughout the first half of the 19th century. Increasingly, citizenship was linked to race. By the eve of the Civil War, the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision declared that no Black person could be a citizen, slave, free. It didn't matter how long your family had been here. In other words, there was a giant dichotomy between the language of equality and the everyday reality of life in the United States. You know, Alexis de Tocqueville said this very clearly in his great work, Democracy in America, when he visited the United States in the 1830s. He said, you know, Americans talk about equality all the time, but there is no equality for Native American people and for African American people. So it is the second founding that actually put the principle of equality into the Constitution. Remember, the Declaration of Independence is not a law. You can't go to court and say, hey, I want my rights under the Declaration of Independence. With the 14th Amendment, equality is now in the Constitution. Often violated.
So what you're saying is equality was not in our Constitution. It was in the language of this declaration, making an assertion, a claim, but the actual legal right as enumerated in a constitution did not happen in America in 1787.
Oh, hardly. And, you know, there were property qualifications all over the place for voting. You didn't have a level playing field in terms of being part of the body politic. And of course, the inequalities related to all sorts of groups. Women, of course, had far fewer rights than men did in the early Republic or throughout most of the 19th century. So yes, people talked about equality a lot, but the legal foundation of equality barely existed before the Civil War and Reconstruction. So that's one of the fundamental changes. Putting equality into the Constitution made the Constitution for the first time a document that people could sort of use. It constitutionalized people's struggle for equality. You could now claim the Constitution was on your side, which you couldn't really claim very effectively 30 or 40 years before the Civil War. If you were demanding, certainly racial equality was pretty hard to find before the Civil War in this country.
What else was different and added in this second founding?
Well, of course, the 15th Amendment barred states from denying anyone the right to vote on account of race. That's the language, on account of race. On the eve of the Civil War, African-American men, free African-American men, could not vote except in a handful of states in New England, where there were hardly any Black people at that time. Almost every state prohibited Black people from voting all through the first half of the 19th century. Actually, at the time of the original founding, there were several states that allowed Black people to vote, including Pennsylvania and even Tennessee, a slave state in the 1790s. But those laws were repealed eventually, and every new state that entered the Union between the Constitution and the Civil War, with one exception, limited voting to white men. The one exception is Maine, which didn't have a lot of black people up there. But in other words, putting black suffrage, black male suffrage, women, of course, were not covered by the 15th Amendment, putting that into the Constitution was a tremendous change in American political life. Since we do pride ourselves on being a democracy, and, you know, as Frederick Douglass said very eloquently, he said, you know, if I lived in Russia, it wouldn't make any difference if I voted or not, because they don't consider themselves a democracy. And so exclusion from voting isn't a stigma. But in the United States, which proclaims over and over again that democracy is the core of our system, to deny someone the right to vote is to just expel them altogether from belonging to the American community. So it made it so the change, putting black suffrage again into the Constitution, was a radical change in the way American politics had operated for the 60 or 70 years, you know, before the Civil War.
And what about the role of the Supreme Court? Because there is no doubt that these amendments were ruled, or at least the interpretation of these amendments were a source of great debate that was settled by the Supreme Court in some pretty revolting cases.
You know, you're completely right. Now, I am not a lawyer. I'm not a law professor. There is a vast law journal article about all these cases. Some of them are very good. Some of them, I think, don't really understand the history of the Reconstruction era. For example, about 20 years ago, Chief Justice Rehnquist, William Rehnquist, published a little book about the election of 1876, which ended Reconstruction. We can talk about that later if you want. But he wrote a book about it. He wanted to be a historian, fine. But his portrait of Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, he called it a Carthaginian peace. Carthaginian peace means where the victor in a war kind of totally tries to destroy the opponent, right? It just completely wipe out their culture, their society, etc. That's what happened in Reconstruction, said the Chief Justice of the United States. Now, if that's what you think Reconstruction amounted to, what you're basically saying is that the granting of basic rights to African American people is a terrible punishment to white people. That was what Rehnquist said. Now, if you believe that, you are not going to take a broad, expansive view of what the Reconstruction amendments entailed. You're going to see Reconstruction as vindictive, as dangerous, as misguided, and your interpretation of those amendments will be very narrow because you think they're kind of illegitimate to begin with. And this is the Chief Justice. It's not just some legislator in some town somewhere. And in this century, in 2003 or 4. So to go back to the Supreme Court decisions, yes, over time, as Rehnquist was simply speaking in a long tradition of, to my mind, misbegotten Supreme Court decisions that consecutively narrowed the scope of the three amendments, the 13th abolishing slavery, the 14th creating birthright, citizenship, and equality for all Americans, the 15th giving Black men the right to vote. These were interpreted over, not in one moment, over a series, over a whole generation, the last quarter of the 19th century, in the narrowest possible way. You know, the language in these amendments is broad and open to interpretation, equal protection of the law. You know, that can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. What about the privileges or immunities of citizens? It doesn't say what those are. It's up to interpretation. What are the privileges of citizenship that no state can take away from you? What about denying people the right to vote? How do you know it's because of race that they're taking away the right to vote if they don't, as is happening today in many legislatures, the laws that are being passed to limit voting in Texas and in Georgia and in other places. They don't say, hey, we're just taking the right to vote away from Black people here. Because if they did that, that would violate the 15th Amendment. But they use all sorts of other supposedly non-racial methods. But the ultimate aim is to limit the voting of minority people of all kinds. Supreme Court lets that happen. So one could go through some of these cases. One of the lesser known ones that really is, I think, even more outrageous than most, Giles v. Harris in around 1902 or 3 came out of Alabama, and it was about Alabama, like other states, had basically taken the right to vote away from Black men at the turn of the century. And Giles, who was the head of the Black political organization, sued, and they went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically just threw up its hands, and it says, if the white people of Alabama want to take the vote away from Black people, there's nothing we can do about it. We are powerless to intervene. We can't enforce the Constitution down there in Alabama. So it gave a green light to all sorts of discriminations, which seem to blatantly violate the 3 constitutional amendments. But the Supreme Court just washed its hands for 50 years or more of the responsibility for enforcing the Constitution. Our Constitution is not self-enforcing. Somebody has to enforce it, whether it's the president or the Congress or the courts. But when the Supreme Court just abdicated, that gave the Jim Crow system being put in place at that time a kind of legal underpinning, which it certainly should not have had.
Well, I was fascinated by the characters, going back to some of the earlier conversation we had about these rather important yet obscure men in history. And I was particularly taken by Thaddeus Stevens, who was truly a radical.
Oh, absolutely.
Here he is, a passage when he is talking about, you talk about Thaddeus Stevens' most cherished aim was to confiscate the land of disloyal planters and divide it among former slaves and northern migrants to the South. The whole fabric of Southern society, he declared, must be changed. Without this government can never be, as it never has been, a true republic. This was a radical guy.
Oh, absolutely. Stevens was, and he was self-proclaimed as a radical. He called himself, and he was part of this group called the Radical Republicans.
He was an elite white man.
No, and he had done this long before the Civil War. One of the things, again, there's so much misconception about Reconstruction. One of the misconceptions is that these guys in Congress didn't really care about Blacks. They just were trying to solidify their hold on power. And so they figured Black people would vote with the Republican Party because Party of Lincoln, et cetera, which was certainly true enough. But this was all partisanship. Well, Thaddeus Stevens in 1837 had walked out of the Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention because it took the vote away from Black men. Black men in Pennsylvania could vote until 1837. When they had a Constitutional Convention, they stuck the word white in there now among the qualifications. Stevens refused to sign. There was no conceivable political advantage to Thaddeus Stevens in 1837 for standing up for the rights of Black men in Pennsylvania. This was a matter of principle to him. And all of these ones, Ashley, Sumner, long before the Civil War, they had fought a very uphill battle for the rights of Black people, not only against slavery, but in favor of the rights of the free Black people in the North. And so these amendments come out of the anti-slavery movement. The people who wrote them are veterans of the anti-slavery movement. They are, as Stevens said, they are hoping to create a true republic, or to use a modern phrase, what they are hoping for is regime change. These were not just little things. change the regime from a pro-slavery regime to an anti-slavery regime and all the things that will go along with that. One other thing I'll say about Stevens is, and this is perhaps vaguely relevant to things going on right now in Congress, Stevens was a radical, no question, but he also knew when to compromise. He knew when you could get only half a loaf, you grabbed it, and then you came back the next year and fought for the other half. But he didn't reject compromises because he hadn't gotten everything he wanted. And I'm not, I don't want to get into what's going on between this group and that group in the Democratic Party in Congress, but that sense that you're in an ongoing process, and what you don't get today, you'll come back and fight for tomorrow. Stevens was a master of that, and he helped to propel Congress along the road to greater and greater equality in this period. But he didn't get the land distribution you mentioned. That was too radical for even many of the radical Republicans.
Exactly.
Taking a whole bunch of property and transferring it from one class of people to another class of people. Of course, African Americans, ex-slaves, were saying, wait a minute, we deserve 40 acres and a mule here. It's our labor that has created the wealth of the South. Now that we're free, we deserve some portion of the wealth that we have created. Otherwise, our freedom will be very, constrained. It didn't happen, though, and of course, most historians think it's a great tragedy that it didn't happen, and that African Americans gained their freedom, of course, but the economic foundation of freedom did not come along with it.
Well, no, you state very powerfully. Clearly, the death of slavery did not automatically mean the birth of freedom. Wars, especially civil wars, often generate hostility and bitterness, but few groups of rebels in history have been treated more leniently than the defeated Confederates. Isn't it interesting when we think about the histories of wars and what the defeated experience in the wake of their defeat? And in many ways, the South may have lost the war, but they won the narrative ultimately.
Yeah, they did. And this, as I said before, vis-a-vis Rehnquist, there is this mythology that the white South was treated with vindictive hatred. Not at all. Virtually nobody was punished in the South for rebellion and treason. Only one person was executed, and that was for what you might call war crimes. The commandant of the Andersonville prison, where a lot of Union soldiers were held and died because of terrible conditions. Most Southerners, white Southerners came back, they regained their rights, the right to vote, the right to do things. A few didn't, maybe Jefferson Davis, but there was no vindictive punishment of these Southern leaders or Confederate soldiers. So underlying that thought, as I said before, is the idea that giving the right to vote to Black people, allowing Black people to hold office, and by my count, between 1,500 and 2,000 Black American men served in some political office during Reconstruction. That's astonishing. 1,500 or 2,000. You know how many Black people held a public office in the United States before the Civil War? 2, as far as I can find. One was a justice of the peace in Massachusetts and another one in Ohio. This was a complete change in Southern politics and national politics. But you can't say that that's a punishment to white Southerners, but although a lot of historians for a long time did seem to feel that way.
Well, let's talk about historians and history making and storytelling, because much of the narrative around this period and much of the narrative arc of American history has been characterized by not full embrace of the truth by historians. I mean, by the men, primarily men, we're talking about, who themselves were charged with narrating the American story.
Yeah.
And yet, and the numbers of historians who were committed. I grew up in the South, in Louisiana and Texas. We were taught that the Southern way of life, the idea of a genteel society, was upended by this war, and that it was a noble cause, and that slavery was a distraction to the larger objectives, was a subsidiary issue. Never was I taught that it was a primary reason, because it didn't fit with that narrative. And historians were in large part responsible for that. Your profession.
Of course, you're right. And, I was taught basically the same thing in the suburbs of New York City, Long Beach, Long Island. This was a national outlook. It wasn't just confined to Louisiana and Texas, of course. The basic idea was Reconstruction was a terrible mistake, a period of misgovernment, corruption. Why? Because Black men were given the right to vote. That was the great mistake. And the reason that was a disaster was that Black people are just incapable of intelligently exercising political rights. That was not only an interpretation of history, but it was a legitimation for the Jim Crow system. As Gunnar Myrdal said in his American Dilemma in 1944, he said, whenever white Southerners are pressed about the Black condition, the absence of rights in the South, they will always respond with the horrors of Reconstruction. If we give Black people the right to vote back, we'll have another replay of the horrors of Reconstruction. And that, and therefore we are justified in abrogating the US Constitution in the Southern states under the Jim Crow system. Now, of course, there were some historians, the great W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction in America, challenged this view head on. And of course, the final chapter of that great book is called The Propaganda of History. History written about Reconstruction was propaganda. I'm an American historian. It's an embarrassment to me. It's a shame to us today that this is the history of our profession, that it played such a central role in legitimating racism in the United States. It no longer does. No historian today accepts the old view of Reconstruction, but echoes of it still flow around in Supreme Court decisions or in the attitudes of jurists, as I mentioned with Rehnquist a while ago.
The people who say, I was involved with the bankruptcy in Detroit, and I recall someone saying, well, this is what happens when you let Black people be in charge of a city. Now, right. This person did not opine on the fact that white flight made possible the complete collapse of the tax base as everyone moved to Grosse Pointe and Bloomfield Hills, leaving a city desecrated financially. So I absolutely think that this thread continues to this day.
Yeah, unfortunately it does. And much less. I mean, it's not like when you and I were growing up, where this was in American history textbooks, for example, don't give you that old view anymore. I think they're quite good in how they generally deal with Reconstruction nowadays. And some of the, most honored books lately about American history have been on one or another aspect of Reconstruction. So, Du Bois's insights are now taken seriously as, Black Reconstruction is taken as a great landmark of American historical writing. But, it was never even reviewed by the American Historical Review when it came out in 1937.
Because it was written by a Black man.
It was written by a Black man, and it was so out of the discourse. It was so hostile to the discourse that was taking place that it couldn't fit in. There were I was never, in my entire career as a student, as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, I was never taught by a Black teacher, never in my life. There just weren't any in the Columbia where I was,
Well, there were at historically Black colleges.
Exactly.
And that's the only place they were allowed to teach.
And that's where a lot of this research was done. It's not just Du Bois. The Journal of Negro History, very few white scholars paid much attention to that. But if you go back to its early days, you find very good articles on Reconstruction, 1920, 1925, just challenging the existing paradigm. But white academia was not listening at that point.
So, Eric, we're going to go to questions. My colleague Lennox, they are going to gather up. Lennox, you got questions?
Yes, we do. Our first question is, Reconstruction is often taught in schools through a very negative lens. How can and should we rethink how this period of US history is taught in schools, universities, and in pop culture?
Yeah, well, we were just talking about that, and I don't know. I differ a little with some of my friends who throw up their hands and say, oh, it's all taught the same way it used to. I don't think that's true. I think the teaching is much better nowadays, and I'm sure it's not perfect, but between textbooks, other books, I've done my little bit. I used to run summer seminars for high school teachers where they would study Reconstruction with me for a week or two and then go back and teach it in a perhaps new kind of way. But I think your basic point, yes, people need to be exposed to this kind of history. I mean, and there's all sorts of ways that, I don't know if you saw, I think you had something to do with this, Darren, the series Amend, the TV about the 14th Amendment.
Yes, about the 14th with Will Smith.
Will Smith. So that's a different mode of communication. I'm not making a Netflix series like Will Smith is, but it gets out to a lot of people, obviously. Yeah. And, I commend him and the others for doing that. The African American History and Culture Museum in Washington is just opening a major new exhibition about Reconstruction, which I hope people, if you're in Washington, go in there and take a look at it. I've been an advisor to it. I think it's going to be extremely good. So yeah, in whatever ways one can disseminate a more modern view of Reconstruction, all to the good.
Do you, though, despair over the faux crisis around critical race theory?
Oh, yeah.
And the teaching, which is not critical race theory, that's a legal doctrine. What they're talking about is the way they want history to be taught, and what should be taught and what should be left out. That has
I do feel it's very dangerous, and I'm waiting for the next Scopes trial. Where the 1920s, Scopes was put on trial in Tennessee for teaching evolution, which was against the law. I'm waiting for an American history teacher to be put on trial for teaching the history of racism in this country. That now is against the law in a number of states that have passed the. And of course, you're right. This has nothing to do with critical race theory. I don't think 1 in 100 legislators who voted on this could give you any kind of definition of what critical race theory is. It's as you said, it's an academic legal approach to understanding how racism is embedded in many American institutions. You're not allowed to teach that anymore in many states. Obviously, I don't care what the subject, we don't want the state legislature censoring what teachers are allowed to say and teach in the classroom. So yeah, it's a backlash against a much more diversified and critical view of American history that has developed very rapidly in the last 10, 20, 30 years. Because
Professor Foner, the many white Americans were comforted by that historical narrative that troubled you. many whites those narratives were constructed to affirm, to valorize the white hierarchy, the white supremacist thinking behind much
Yeah.
of this. And so how dare you seek to upend and disrupt that kind of teaching that makes us feel good? Please, I refuse to learn history that makes me feel uncomfortable. And certainly I don't want my children to feel uncomfortable for what happened in the past.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, I don't think children should be blamed for what happened in the 1890s, or what. It's not, a child today has no say in what the Supreme Court did or didn't do in 1896 or something like that. When people raise that with me, I say, there's another way of thinking about this, which is to take pride in those people who fought against this system, who fought to overturn it, the founders of the second founding, people like that, people like Frederick Douglass or Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Debs or many others, the people who tried to challenge a racist system. I think that's where you get pride in your country and your heritage, regardless of what your race may be, in looking back at those people who fought to make this a better society.
And in fact, history should, if it is history, at times make you feel uncomfortable or regret. Think about what German school children as young as 6 years old, when they start to learn about the Holocaust. You learn about the Holocaust in Germany in primary education because the German people are so committed to ensuring that never happens again and to show the scourge of hate and anti-Semitism and racism and what it can do. And yet in America, we are much more ambivalent about our feelings as it relates to the scourge of slavery, because there is this conundrum that I think that is a part of the American psyche that goes unspoken. And it goes like this. Yes, this horrible system was in place, but we wouldn't be the great country we are without that system. So I can't completely disregard it as an evil, horrible thing, because in some ways I'm then denying what we built here in this country.
There are certainly people who feel that. And what you said before is absolutely right, that this image of our history was consciously created. The Daughters of the Confederacy played a major role in the early part of the 20th century in spreading what we call the myth of the lost cause. As you say, some of it was to just, it's not exactly to say slavery was great and with so wonderful.
Oh no,
slavery,
it just wasn't that bad. It wasn't
right,
that
but
bad.
But it wasn't really that terrible. And anyway, Black people really were kind of uncivilized, and this brought them into civilization.
Yes.
But then in the lost cause, and then as you say, slavery was not really the cause of the Civil War. It was states' rights, And finally, Reconstruction comes in as the punishment that even though the North maybe was right to fight against slavery, they kind of gave up that status by imposing Black voting on the South after the Civil War. So a very negative view of Reconstruction was part of this lost cause mythology. It wasn't just about slavery. It was also about, go back to the film Birth of a Nation, which we've all seen in one way or another. And, Reconstruction is the core of the whole second half and a legitimation of the Ku Klux Klan. It glorifies the Klan because of the so-called horrors of Reconstruction. So I guess I'm rambling around here, but the main point is this history matters. What we think about that history matters. It's not just an academic exercise. What you think about Reconstruction helps to shape what you think our society is or should be right now, today.
Lennox,
Yes. Our next question is, with this deeper understanding of the Reconstruction era and how it continues to impact us today, what needs to happen for us to move forward? What can the average person do to support these efforts?
You know, a lot of average people have been doing a lot of things in the last couple of years. Thousands last year were marching in the street doing what, you know, in Black Lives Matter or other, or George Floyd, demonstrations. I don't think it's right for a historian to come and say, look, you should be doing this, this, and the other thing. I think what you should do is make a commitment to trying to figure out how can I play a part in positive change. It may be something very local. It may be something national. It may be voting. It may be joining an organization, taking part in a demonstration. One thing we can learn from the struggle against slavery is that there is no one true way of dealing with this. The struggle against slavery included all sorts of people and all sorts of tactics. Some of them said, we're forming a political party against slavery. Others said, no, we can't do that because then you're you're operating under a pro-slavery constitution. Some of them said, no, we need violence. John Brown, we're going to overthrow slavery in a slave revolution. None of them were right or wrong. The more tactics people use, the more approaches people use, the better, is my opinion. I don't think there's one true way at any particular juncture. And, you know, that we can learn from them about that and just look around us and see what we are comfortable doing. I don't expect people who don't find it comfortable to sit in you know, someone's office and get dragged out by the police. If that's not the thing you feel like doing, don't do it, but find some other venue where you can express your views and try to help solve some of these deep problems we have in our society.
Next question, Lennox.
Thank you for that. And as a final question, how much hope do you have in the Constitution nowadays, given that states are actively dismantling civil rights?
Well, you know, there's an old saying, the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. And I'm sorry to have to say that I believe we have a Supreme Court which is not committed to a vigorous use of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to expand the realm of equality in this country and to try to address some of the deep inequalities that we still confront. I am very nervous about what the Supreme Court will be doing as cases come up about voter suppression, affirmative action, other kinds of issues. I don't, you know, we have a weird spectacle lately where Supreme Court justices have been traipsing around the country giving lectures, telling people how they really deserve more respect, that people think Barrett did this, Breyer did this, and one of the others, I can't remember, you know, maybe it was Gorsuch, that, you know, oh no, people think the Supreme Court is political, but we're not political at all. We just operate on the basis of different legal philosophies. Well, a legal philosophy is a political point of view. I'm sorry, justices, you can't get away from it that simply. If you are appointed by a president who says publicly, I appointed these people exactly in order to do X, Y, and Z, and then they go and do it, you can hardly claim to be aloof from politics. So, you know, we had one period in the late 19th century where in a series of decisions, the Supreme Court just whittled away, and pretty much abrogated these amendments for a long time. I hope we're not heading toward a similar kind of process today. But what does give me optimism is exactly what I was speaking about before, the large number of people who were willing to take to the streets in the last couple of years to express their, you know, the need for really significant social change in this country. We don't know, it's much too early to know what the long-term consequences of that will be. But I'm inspired by these young people who are willing to, to step out into the public realm and demand change. That's where it's going to be coming from.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Eric Foner. This has been a great conversation. Your book, I commend it to everyone. Please get The Second Founding. It is a great read, and you, as you always do when you read Eric Foner, you learn something. I want to really just express on behalf of everyone at Ford Foundation, Eric, a hearty thanks and congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, Darren. I appreciate it.
And I ask you to please save these dates because we've got 4 extraordinary speakers over the next 3 weeks. My friend Anita Hill will be with us on October the 12th to talk about her new book, Believing. And we will have Professor Ajit Banerjee, who is the Ford professor at MIT, and Esther Duflo, talking about their book, Good Economics for Hard Times. And my friend, Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter on October 25th, her new book, Renewal. I look forward to seeing you on October 12th. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great day.